Okay, so you hear about these cases sometimes and you just think, is that even possible? Like someone claiming to have murdered like over 3,000 people?
Yeah,
It sounds insane, right?
it does.
And that's exactly what we're looking at today for you, this idea of Henry Lee Lucas, the sources that kind of built up this story and why it took such a hold on the public imagination.
Right.
I mean, you might think, true crime, but we're going a little deeper here for you.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going beyond the headlines to try to understand the deeper currents that are at play for you here.
Yeah, exactly. So we have this audio recording featuring Sarah Marshall and Rachel Monroe,
Right.
and their conversation, helps us unpack this whole story and this phenomenon.
Yeah. What's interesting to consider right from the start is how this one single confession could ignite such a widespread phenomenon for you.
Right.
And our mission, I guess, today is not just to recount the events, but to understand like the mythology of the serial killer that he really helped to create
Mm.
and the societal factors that allowed it to flourish.
Yeah, exactly. And so let's start at the beginning for you.
Yeah.
It's 1983, and Lucas is arrested in a small Texas town for the murder of Kate Rich.
Okay.
Pretty standard stuff so far, right?
Seems straightforward.
But then during his arraignment, he drops this bombshell. He'd committed about 100 of them.
Wow.
Can you imagine just being in that courtroom?
Oh man. Yeah, that immediately created a media frenzy.
Right.
Yeah, do you have this man no one's really heard of, and he's suddenly claiming responsibility for, this huge number of deaths.
Right.
And the audio mentions this really incredible detail for you. A local resident complaining about dust from the news helicopters soiling her laundry.
Wow.
It really highlights for you the stark contrast between this ordinary life of this small town
Mhm.
and then the sudden sensationalism that just descended upon it.
Yeah.
It's one of those surprising facts that just makes you pause and think about the absurdity of it all.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum for you.
Yeah.
The early 1980s were a very particular time culturally.
Right.
There was this underlying public speculation, almost an obsession,
Yeah.
uh, with the idea of numerous unknown serial killers kind of lurking out there.
Yeah, out there in society.
Right, and the audio references this opinion piece in the Anniston, Alabama Star Gazette,
Yeah.
where some guy was trying to estimate how many serial killers were on the loose.
Right.
It sounds almost comical now, but it reflects a real societal anxiety at the time.
Yeah, for sure. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this was the post-Ted Bundy era.
Right.
Slasher films had a huge influence on the public perception of what a serial killer was like for you.
Right.
And politically, the Reagan administration's focus on violent crime and victimhood really shaped the language and the concerns around these issues for you.
Yeah.
It created a really fertile ground for this idea of like a widespread serial killer threat to take root in the public consciousness.
Hmm. Yeah, and then just weeks after Lucas's initial confession starts making waves,
Oh, wow.
there's a Senate hearing on serial murder.
Wow. Talk about timing.
Talk about timing, right? And who testifies.
Right.
Anne Rule,
course.
of course, solidifying this image of the serial killer in the public consciousness.
Yes, absolutely. And what's interesting to consider here is her definition that she put forward, the serial killer, as a traveling troller who encounters victims randomly driven by this inner rage.
Right.
She even claimed some traveled up to 200,000 miles a year.
Oh, wow.
When you do the math for yourself, that's over 500 miles a day, every day.
Yeah, that's a lot of driving.
It really stretches credulity, and it highlights this societal need to kind of inflate the figure of the serial killer into something almost superhuman.
Yeah, it's like they're these criminal masterminds.
Exactly.
But the audio actually points out for you this need to kind of deflate that grandeur a little bit. Maybe it's less about some criminal mastermind and more about failures in detection.
Right.
If the police aren't catching them, does it make them seem bigger and scarier?
That's a good point, and this raises a really important question for you.
Mm.
Does inflating the image of the serial killer deflect from other, perhaps more uncomfortable truths about violence in society?
Right.
Shortly after those Senate hearings, the Department of Justice held a press conference where they actually declared a serial killer epidemic.
Wow.
And they pointed to this statistic for you of around 20,000 murders a year and a declining murder clearance rate of 72%,
Yeah.
which, as the audio notes, is actually quite high by today's standards.
Yeah, it is.
But they used this declining clearance rate to fuel the idea that all those unsolved murders, around 4,000 a year, must be the work of serial killers.
Right, and it's the same flawed logic we saw with the inflated statistics around missing children.
Right.
Where every missing child was somehow a stranger abduction.
Exactly. It seems like fear really has a way of distorting data. And so what we're seeing is how societal fear, coupled with a desire for easy answers,
Hmm.
can lead to the misinterpretation and manipulation of data
Right.
and ultimately paint this distorted picture of the problem.
Yeah. And what's interesting to think about here too is what that means in terms of, where law enforcement resources are going. If you're
Right.
so focused on this stranger danger,
Yeah.
are you overlooking more common sources of violence?
Right. What's interesting to consider for you is this potential implication, by focusing on stranger danger and this lone wolf serial killer archetype.
Yeah.
Might we have inadvertently drawn attention away from more common sources of violence,
Right.
like domestic disputes or violence within families?
Exactly. And then into this environment steps Henry Lee Lucas,
Right.
confessing to hundreds of murders across dozens of states.
Right. And what's striking for you is this complete lack of a consistent signature in these crimes.
Yeah.
He supposedly killed people in every way imaginable, targeting all demographics.
Right. It's the opposite of the established idea of a serial killer having a specific method or type of victim.
Yeah, for sure. And then you have this Henry and Otis narrative emerge.
Yeah, right.
His supposed accomplice, Otis Toole, and their coast-to-coast killing spree.
Yeah.
And this idea of a duo, this kind of Bonnie and Clyde of serial murder,
Yeah.
really solidified this larger-than-life, almost mythical image.
Right.
The audio even quotes Lucas as saying, I killed him, this way, this way, this way, everything except poison,
Wow.
a claim he later contradicts.
Right. Of course.
It's almost like he's creating a monster for you
Right.
to fit the moment.
Yeah, and this narrative, as outlandish as it sounds, had a real appeal, didn't it?
It did.
I mean, both for law enforcement and the media.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was a ready-made story.
Yeah, and while he's spinning these tales, he's getting some pretty cushy treatment in jail, right?
Yeah, I mean, unlimited coffee and cigarettes,
Yeah.
that's a serious perk for, someone in custody.
Yeah, it starts to feel like the story of Scheherazade.
A little bit, right?
He's got to keep coming up with these stories.
Constantly needing to come up with a new tale to maintain his favorable situation.
Right, and the audio mentions, he was fond of strawberry milkshakes.
Oh, wow.
That they'd even take him out to lunch.
Wow.
He befriends a nun, Sister Clemmy,
Oh, wow.
becomes a born-again Christian, and even starts dictating which reporters could interview him based on their coverage of the Texas Rangers.
Oh, wow. It's an incredible elevation of status
Yeah.
for someone in his position.
Yeah, and it really highlights, I think, the perverse incentives at play for law enforcement in this situation.
Yeah.
Suddenly they have this guy who can solve hundreds of cold cases
Right.
without the messy business of trials and actual evidence. It offers a sense of closure for families,
Oh,
even
can I-
if that closure is based on a lie.
And what's interesting to consider is the ease with which these cases could be closed.
Yeah.
Flying Lucas around the country on private planes to point out alleged crime scenes.
Right.
It all seems so improbable.
Yeah.
How could he possibly remember specific details over such a vast number of alleged crimes and across so many years?
Right. And eventually the cracks in this narrative start to appear.
Right.
People begin questioning his claims and inconsistencies emerge.
Yeah, the audio mentions the invented fake case
Yeah.
that Lucas confessed to, which really should have been a huge red flag for everyone involved.
Right.
And then there were his rather unconvincing cartoonish drawings of victims.
Yeah, and one of the key examples is the case of Deborah Sue Williamson in Levelland, Texas.
Right.
Lucas confessed to her murder in the summer of 1975, but the timeline just doesn't add up.
Yeah.
He was released from prison in Maryland just 2 days before the murder.
Yeah. The geography alone makes his involvement virtually impossible.
Exactly. He flew to Baltimore and then took a bus to Maryland to stay with his half-sister immediately after his release.
Right. Just underscores how flimsy some of these confessions were.
Yeah, and then you have figures like Hugh Ainsworth, a reporter who had interviewed Ted Bundy, becoming increasingly suspicious.
Yeah.
And Lucas starts making these outlandish claims, committing murders in Japan, involvement in Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance,
Right.
even supplying poison for the Jonestown suicides.
Right. These claims become so far-fetched, they almost become comical
Yeah.
if the underlying subject matter wasn't so tragic.
Yeah, and then it gets even weirder. He invents this murderous satanic group called the Hands of Death,
Wow.
that supposedly paid him and Otis to kidnap babies for their ceremonies.
Wow, it's almost like a perfect storm of societal anxieties.
Right.
The fear of serial killers merging with the satanic panic of the era.
Exactly. He was tapping into this cultural zeitgeist in a really disturbing way.
Yeah, and what's interesting to consider is Lucas's ability to seemingly create a narrative that addressed multiple prevailing fears and anxieties in society.
Right.
The 1986 Texas Attorney General's Office report, the Lucas Report, was crucial in meticulously investigating and ultimately debunking many of his claims.
Yeah, that report really laid bare the logistical impossibilities of his confessed timeline.
Yeah.
The audio gives this absurd example of his alleged travel itinerary in October 1979,
Right.
bouncing between multiple states, committing murders with different weapons, all within a few days.
It's just physically and logically impossible.
Yeah, and the reality of Lucas's life, as uncovered by the report, was far less sensational. He was mostly moving between relatives' houses, having minor run-ins with the law, selling blood, applying for food stamps, traffic violations.
Right. There was no evidence to support this elaborate timesheet forging scheme
Right.
that some had suggested.
Yeah, and in several cases where Lucas confessed, the truth eventually came out.
That
The audio mentions the woman whose death initially attributed to Lucas was later found to be accidental. She drove off the road during a seizure. And in other instances, other individuals, like the victim's husband, later confessed to the murders.
Yeah, this really underscores the danger of prioritizing a confession over actual evidence and thorough investigation.
Right.
The report also hinted at a more likely reality, Lucas preying on vulnerable individuals within his own family,
Right.
including molesting his stepdaughters, which he denied.
Yeah, and then adding another layer of complexity.
Right.
Lucas later recanted his mass confessions,
Wow.
claiming he only killed 3 people, his mother, Freda, or Becky Powell and Kate Rich, or sometimes even just his mother.
Wow. So he went from thousands to hundreds to 3,
Yeah.
or even just 1.
Right, and he even claimed the confessions were a deliberate act to expose police incompetence.
Wow. This highlights the unreliability of his testimony at every stage.
Yeah, it really does, and it's plausible that police leading questions or even feeding him information played a role in these confessions.
Yeah, absolutely. And the audio really points to this inherent fragility in the system of solving crimes,
Right.
especially when human biases come into play.
Yeah, ultimately, the story of Henry Lee Lucas feels like this disturbing co-creation,
Right.
a myth built by Lucas and law enforcement for their own reasons.
Yeah, it's dead.
And despite the debunking, many of these cases remain cleared based on his false confessions,
Right.
and there seems to have been little accountability.
Right. And we're left with these competing narratives, the hundreds of victims versus only a handful,
Right.
and a lack of concrete DNA evidence linking him to the vast majority of the confessed crimes.
Yeah, and what's interesting to think about too is, this whole episode reveals some underlying societal needs and dangers.
Absolutely. The public's appetite for these horrific stories, the creation of this almost cartoonishly evil figure,
Right.
the Johnny Cash of serial killers, as the audio aptly calls him.
Right, and by focusing on this exceptional boogeyman, are we distracting ourselves from more common and perhaps more uncomfortable forms of violence?
Right. And the audio touches on this idea of not romanticizing or exaggerating the intelligence or capabilities of violent individuals.
Right.
Violence often stems from smallness and stuntedness, not greatness.
Right, and this raises a question for, where we focus our attention and our fear.
Right.
By being fixated on this, sensationalized figure, are we less likely to recognize violence in its more common and less dramatic forms?
Right. The guy down the street.
Exactly. So to kind of bring it all together,
Yeah.
the story of Henry Lee Lucas is a stark reminder of how easily a myth can be created, the fallibility of memory and confession, and the powerful societal forces that shape our understanding of crime.
This leads to a final provocative thought for you. Consider how our fascination with extreme narratives, the boogeymen of our culture, might blind us to more everyday realities.
Yeah.
What truly makes someone dangerous, and are we looking for the monster in the shadows while overlooking the potential for harm much closer to home?
It's a chilling thought and something for all of us to consider.
It encourages you to think critically about the stories we consume and why they resonate so deeply.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.